This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Jacob Winograd. Jacob is the host of two great podcasts, the Biblical Anarchy podcast, which he hosts on the Libertarian Christian Institute's Christians for Liberty Network, and the Take Human Action Pennsylvania podcast, which covers libertarian politics. Jacob believes that an anarchist view of government is compatible with biblical teaching, and we are going to discuss all things anarchism on today's show. Jacob, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Awesome, man. I'm glad to be here. You know, I forgot. So you said I do two podcasts, and I thought you were going to mention the Daniel 3 podcast, which I retired, and I was going to have to correct you. And then you said, I was like, that's right. I do also do a second. Like, no matter what, I do two podcasts. I can't escape.
Yes. Well, and with the Libertarian Mises Caucus podcast that you do, you also have all of the old Biblical Anarchy episodes in that podcast stream too. So if people want to go back into your back catalog, they have all of that stuff right there. So good stuff.
Including episode 92, which I think was the one I had you on. You were like the last interview I did on the Daniel 3 podcast. So
yeah,
it was that special position.
It's an honor to have been a very historical part of that podcast. Before we talk about anarchism today, just tell us a little bit about your background, your work, and kind of what you do.
Sure. So I am a former Bernie Sanders Democratic Socialist Democrat. I was very predominantly on the left, even though I was raised in a right-wing household. And I was also pretty much like a progressive Christianity. And then 2016 happened, and then I went through this 2-year transition where I basically started challenging a lot of the different beliefs I had, and long story short, ended up doing a complete transformation into a more, on the theological end, embracing more of a historic, traditional view of more like Orthodox Christianity, and then on the political end, sort of like traveling through classical liberalism and more of a, kind of like center-right position after leaving the left, and then discovering libertarianism, and then ending up a anarcho-capitalist. And then once I became an anarchist, so to speak, politically, I decided, okay, well, how does this, intersect with my faith, and are these things compatible? And I was convicted to like do my homework and to make sure I wasn't like, I was like, I want to submit to the Bible first and foremost, not a man-made political ideology. That spawned the Daniel 3 podcast, which was basically kind of like a 1.5 to 2 year journey of me, exploring those topics. And, I came to the point where I became convinced that not only were was libertarianism and anarchism compatible with Christianity, but I think that if we take Scripture seriously about what it teaches on government, on human authority, on the kingdom of God, I think we necessarily end up with views on government, on political structure, and et cetera, that are necessarily libertarian or anarchist in their nature. So that's a little background on me and on, sort of like what my interests are and the things that I talk about over on my podcast.
Yeah, anarchy is a very controversial term. And I remember growing up, the vision that I had in my head of anarchy is people out in the streets, like throwing bricks through windows and everything like that. And I think that in at least the United States, that's the connotation that a lot of people have with anarchy. And so naturally, Christians who should be peaceful people are afraid of anarchy as a concept. And I think a lot of that has to do with the definition. So before we get into this conversation, could you define anarchism for us? Like, what does that term actually mean, as opposed to kind of like the caricature that we see in the media?
Sure, yeah. So, anarchy has different definitions based on, like, if you looked at a textbook definition, or you went back and tried to go, like, you took a political philosophy course and got a definition there. But, like, the common thread of what distinguishes anarchy as a political philosophy is that it is a opposition to unjust hierarchy and authority. And it believes in more of what would be like known as horizontal and egalitarian hierarchies. So it's actually a misconception. People define anarchism as a complete rejection of all hierarchy and all authority, which is not true. Even like the original anarchist, like anarchists like Proudhon, they didn't, completely reject the need for property. They didn't, deny the need for there to be some sort of systems of like people negotiating and working out their problems, governing in a sense, and there needing to be some sort of rules in society. But rather, what anarchy in its different forms has always objected to is the idea of like masters, and in terms of like there would be either one person or a group of people who have the privileges or like a special status where their rights are different than the rights of other people. And so in a sense, another way of describing it is that anarchism is to believe in an equality of rights among all people. And that means that, if we say it's wrong to steal, right? It's wrong to murder. It's wrong to extort someone or to entrap them. That's wrong for everybody, whether they are, just a normal citizen, or they are a politician, or they are a police officer, or they are in the military. Like what's wrong for you is also wrong for me and is wrong for everyone else. And nobody has the right to be, through an initiation of force, the master over someone else. That doesn't mean, however, that there aren't within voluntary interactions natural hierarchies or natural forms of authority that emerge in those kinds of settings. So that's a kind of like a good way to start, I think, in defining what anarchy is. Where the slogan is, no rulers, no masters, and what a lot of anarchists then have also come to saying is that anarchy means no rulers, but it doesn't mean no rules. It just means that there's no. Another way to look at it is it's a very long-winded answer. I'm opening up a lot of different doors here, but there's so many ways to expound this topic. I also think an important aspect here is it's the separation of the state from government, because I think that government or the act of governing is a process that is very human, that's very natural, it's very biblical even. And there's always going to be some form of government. But does the government need to be in the form of what we would call the state? Does it need to be a monopoly over governance? Does it need to be governance that is formed through the initiation of violence that ends up in what I described earlier, people who have, the ability or the perceived ability, at least, to be morally justified or legitimate in violating the very rules that they are proclaiming to defend. So I think that's a good way to start out in defining what anarchy is.
All right, there were a lot of really great points that you brought up there. My own position right now, I don't describe myself as an anarchist because I have this belief in this Lockean conception of natural rights, and I do believe that government has to exist in order to protect our natural rights. But I've oftentimes wondered, and again, a lot of this has been from listening to you and some of the other people on the Christians for Liberty Network, if there isn't a difference between government and the state. And you seem to think that within anarchism, there is, that you can have governance without having to have the state. So how would you define or explain the difference between the state and government? Because I think a lot of people conflate those two terms and just assume that they mean the same thing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think that broadly speaking, government is sort of like the process of administering rules on, within a particular group of people. Government or governing, so to speak, happens all the time. I mean, I think, you could describe a hierarchy of authority and the structures within like a business or a church as essentially, like a self-governing system. Like, there's people who are conducting the affairs of that particular body. So, governing and governments come in all different, not just different, sizes, but also in different shapes and forms. I mean, there are more democratic ways of governing bodies of people. So, for example, I'm involved in the Libertarian Party, and in the Libertarian Party and its various state and local affiliates, things are traditionally governed in a sense and in a democratic fashion. We hold elections, we vote on motions, etc. But not everything is always, governed in democratic processes. I think about, my church, and my church has, some things that are decided democratically, but other things that, there's like a there are specific deacons or elders or the pastor who, they have more of a unilateral authority. You could think of like a business that's like a sole proprietorship, and the sole proprietor, the owner, has, the final say and can basically just make the rules and enforce them as they see fit. And so the state technically is, in a way, a form of governance, but it's a form of governance that is built upon, the initiation of force to gain its authority. Like, there's different ways. Like, authority is basically like when someone submits to you on a particular thing, right? And so, like, parents have authority over their children. Teachers have authority over their students. A boss has authority over its employees. Like, for example, like, we're both part of the Christians for Liberty Network. And in a sense, our CEO, Doug, has a measure of authority over, what we do on our podcasts and things like that. But that is authority that we have submitted to voluntarily, or that has occurred naturally. Like the authority parents have over their children occurs naturally. The authority that teachers have over their students, happens through market means, and those authorities are necessarily limited. Like, so Doug can tell you or I don't think that's, a good topic for a podcast. We can't do that on the Christians for Liberty Network. Or he could say, hey, you need to clip this thing out of your podcast. But he couldn't be like, hey, you can't go and ever do a podcast again. You know what I mean? Or he can't tell us like, or he couldn't overreach into our lives to be like, oh, you can't listen to this particular music. You know what I mean? Or you can't read this particular book, or you can't support, like if Doug had told me, if Doug was like, oh, you can't, be a member of the Libertarian Party or something silly like that. You know what I mean? Like, that's an overreach of authority that his authority is necessarily limited to the sphere that he has, that the authority he has been delegated to. And so the state is authority that is derived by force, and it's government that is constructed upon this type of extortion and this sort of like, it's almost grabbed by fiat, in the same way that the currency is established by fiat. It's a good way to think about it. You can have just in the same way you can have real money, you can have hard money like gold or silver, or people trading in, like material goods, or if it's paper money, it's at least backed by something legitimate, or you can have fiat money that's just backed by faith in the system or something like that. And that's, the same way that I think government and authority works. You can have government and authority that's constructed through the market, that's earned by competence, that's earned by people exchanging mutual value and things like that, all the things we talk about as free market libertarians. Or you can have authority and governments that are constructed via coercion and via threats of violence.
Yeah, I know that you talk about anarcho-capitalism, and so that's a really important qualifier to this. So explain how the capitalism part fits into anarchy.
Yeah, so I did a deep dive on this on actually my pilot episode for the new podcast, the Biblical Anarchy podcast with LCI. But so going to backtrack a little bit before we get to anarcho-capitalism, even like the first anarchists, like I talked about Proudhon on that podcast, believed in the necessity for property rights, but he had concerns about the sort of like, more mercantile form of capitalism that he was witnessing and stuff, where there was great income inequality, there was very low wages being handed out, there was a concern over renting property and things like that, but at the same time, Proudhon, obviously said like people to be free have to be able to like own things and to be able to trade things. And so, he was against like rent, and he was against like wage labor and things like that, but he wasn't fundamentally against property rights entirely. But then you have later in the development of these ideas, you have people like Murray Rothbard and the Austrian School of Economics sort of like putting their fingerprint on libertarianism and also anarchism as a consequence, and basically realizing, well, if we want to live in a society that is, completely free of coercion, that's completely free of the state, that necessarily means that everything happens within the market. And so if everything's going to happen within the market, then we can't shy away from capitalism and property rights. But really, we have to, maximize our support and understanding of property rights and where they come from, and how we legitimately acquire and trade property with one another, because that's the basis for a peaceful society that can exist without the state. So like in capitalism, it's not this, we have to like deprogram the caricatures of capitalism that like the left and that like government schools and stuff have taught us, where it's just all about greed and it's about people trying to get ahead of everyone, and it's a cutthroat kind of thing. I mean, I'm not saying that human greed and things like that don't exist within capitalism, but primarily what distinguishes capitalism from other economic models is that in capitalism, you literally are forced to, if you want someone to do something, what you have to do is find something that person wants and provide it to them, whether it's a material good, whether it's a service. You have to find, it's value for value. That's how capitalism works. Everything is a voluntary transaction. And so the way that then anarchism connects to capitalism, and why the form of anarchism that I most strongly associate with is anarcho-capitalism, is because I think that those two, they're a fulfillment of each other, or they work like synergistically. It's like, if we want to live in a society of sort of like more egalitarian hierarchies, we necessarily need to have a economic system that is built upon property rights and upholding them, because where we maximize property rights and we say, you know what, you own yourself, you own your labor, you own the products of your labor. No one else has a claim to your body or to the things that you have, made with your labor, or that you've freely, acquired through trade and things like that. If we strongly uphold and defend those rights to property and self-ownership, we consequentially get to that sort of anarchist society and anarchist forms of government that we necessarily want.
Yeah, I'm completely behind you on that. I think one of my biggest challenges with trying to understand anarchy, and I know that there are good answers out there, and I just haven't read the books yet on this. You make the point that in that kind of anarcho-capitalist system, you have to defend private property and individual liberties and things like that. Who does the defense of that in an anarcho-capitalist system?
Right. So it's not like, I mean, we don't have an anarcho-capitalist system right now, so it's not like there are definitive answers on this. But what we can reasonably conclude is that there would be basically like private governmental structures that would take different forms. You'd have private courts, you'd have private security agencies. You'd probably also have an expansion within the insurance field, like individual or even collective like insurance organizations that like sort of like represent people. And like, so, what you have to do in a system devoid of the state to enforce rules is basically, work things out through contract law. And then, if all rights are property rights in a anarcho-capitalist system, well, then how do we enforce those property rights? Well, we have to enforce them through contracts, and we have to use third-party arbitration. So that creates, demand for a lot of the same services that exist today in the statist system that we have. We have courts, we have defense systems, we have, insurance companies and stuff that insure us for different liabilities in different areas. If we relegated these things to the market, what we would see is market forces acting on those things and providing the kind of innovation and spawning of just things that we probably can't even imagine right now, because we've delegated those areas to a monopoly. And monopoly doesn't have any incentive to innovate, right? Monopoly is stale. When all you have to do to get money or get people to participate in your service is just like, hey, like I'm your only option, and if you don't use me, I can lock you up in a cage. I can initiate force against you. You know what I mean? Like there's really no incentive to innovate and to provide better service. Whereas, that's one of the great utilities of capitalism and the free market, is that when you are forced, like I said earlier, like you have to provide value for value, which means you have to find ways to provide the services that people want and do it it keep innovating to do those services better and to do them cheaper than the other guy. So what this does is it creates a system of competing, just like you have in the car insurance. Like not car insurance industry is still regulated to some extent, but it's one of the few insurance areas in America that's still not completely overrun with like state control. And so like auto insurance, even if you've been like in multiple accidents and stuff, is still obtainable and relatively affordable because there's so many different options and companies that are competing. And so they try to keep their rates low. They try to offer different perks, different gimmicks or things like that, different ways to expand and to make that if you have to file a claim, make it easier, make it more efficient. And so we can think of that and then theorize how those same forces that make technology improve constantly, that come up with all these different medical innovations, come up with all these advances in infrastructure and stuff, would also come to bear on how we handle dispute resolution, whether it's disputes over property or disputes over like broken contracts or providing security if there's been a initiation of aggression.
Would you need a document like the Constitution in an anarcho-capitalist society?
So, you would need. I don't think you would have something necessarily like the Constitution. What you would have, so like there's a term that anarcho-capitalists use called DROs, which are like dispute resolution organizations, and essentially it's like again, we don't have an ANCAP society to look at. This is our best idea of how it would probably work, is that people would be incentivized to want to do business with people who that like they knew that like this person, if something goes wrong in this transaction, that like there's like a trying to find wording here, that they have some kind of agency that is vetting them, saying that we think this person is trustworthy, this person will stand behind their contracts, and if they don't, we have backed them and we're saying that we are going to provide liability coverage for if they don't, right? And so essentially what you're doing is you're creating this system of financial incentives for people to do things like to stand behind their word, to not commit fraud, to not steal from one another, etc. Now, you would not be forced to deal with like a dispute resolution organization. You could decide, I'm not going to pay for it. No one would force you to. But then people would be free to not do business with you. You know what I mean? A lot of companies would be like, oh, you don't have, it'd be like people not wanting to sell you a car if you didn't have car insurance, right? They'd be like, it's like, and the banks kind of handle that right now at a large degree. They're like, you want to buy a new car? You better have car insurance and you better have full coverage, right? So it's like, so there's a lot, that's an example of how, like there wouldn't be, there's like the Constitution is kind of like this contract between the state and the Constitution is really a contract between the like the original states and the states that have come into the union since then and the federal government. But it's also more abstractly a quote unquote contract between the people and the government, broadly speaking. And it's sort of like, so you would kind of have something like that. But again, you wouldn't have this like monopoly contract for everybody in a geographic area. Basically it's like a term that I actually stole from another one of our co-hosts in the Christians for Liberty Network, Carrie Baldwin, is it's a good way to think about it is that it's a polycentric legal order. Rather than having a monocentric where it's just like, one monopoly over that geographic area, within a geographic area, you can have competing legal systems. And this might, I can almost like guess where the next question would be, which is like, well, if you have competing legal systems, doesn't that lead to like, like what if you have one legal system where something's illegal and another legal system where that thing isn't illegal, and you have people in those different legal systems that come into conflict with each other? How does that get hashed out? That's a common objection that people have to this sort of like idea of market governance. And so the reason why, so there's answers to that. but it's also not a good objection because we already have that today.
Yeah.
Because every country has different laws. And heck, even within the United States, every state has different laws. And so there would be negotiations and like diplomacy of a sort between these different, in the same way, like there are negotiations and contracts between the different like insurance companies. Like if you, let's say you and I got into a collision and I had Allstate and you had State Farm, well, they already have like a set of procedures for what they do if they have clients of each other that are in an altercation, and they know how to handle that through, and anytime you sign up for insurance, if you read all the fine print, it's all, you'll see stuff about like third party arbitration and how they're going to handle this stuff. Car insurance claims get handled very efficiently and very rarely end up going to like some kind of state court or something. They often get handled internally, or they get handled through third party arbitration and whatnot, and things proceed, rather efficiently. So that's kind of how things would work out in a polycentric legal order. It's not that different than today. It's just expanding on principles that already exist and decreasing the degree to which we solve these problems through violence.
Yeah, and like you said before, all of these services that people want the government to provide are now provided by the government, but it's monopoly providers. So there's no competition. There's absolutely no incentive for them to provide us with a high quality service. And well-connected politicians and corporations can just buy off politicians to make sure that these services benefit them at the expense of other people.
Right.
And you wouldn't get that in a polycentric society.
You're right. Or it'd be much harder. Like you could still have corruption. You could still have people who are rich who would be try to like gain advantages in the market. But what you wouldn't have is like right now, if you had let me put it this way, if you had a total free market system, the most that like a rich corporation could do would be to try to get one of these agencies to like pass their internal regulations and rules and stuff in ways that like benefit them, but then the other insurance companies don't have to do that. You know what I mean? And they also, another advantage that we have here is like right now, if there's companies that aren't doing good in the free market or they just don't want the competition, right now what happens is they go to the state government and they basically lobby for regulations that help to push out their competition. I mean, this happened. This doesn't just happen today. Like this is going back all the way to even like Rockefeller and like the Gilded Age and stuff. Like we remember learning about the Gilded Age in my in my history class, and looking back at it now through my libertarian lens, it's like even back then the those big industrialists and tycoons, they were lobbying the state to get monopolies over certain regions to be the provider for this region, or to pass regulations that would put their competition out of business. Tom Woods, by the way, is a great resource to go and learn all this stuff. I will just shout him out. But it's like, so we want to eliminate that, and that's something I cared about a lot as a former lefty, right? Like I hated the relationship between big business and government, but the problem is, expanding the government doesn't fix that problem. It just makes it worse.
Right. Well, libertarianism is kind of a big tent, and there are different ways of being libertarian. You talked about being a classical liberal, and for a long time after I discovered libertarianism, I described myself as a classical liberal as well. And then you also have the kind of in-between classical liberal and anarchist position that is known as menarchism. Could you maybe just explain briefly what classical liberalism and menarchism are and how they compare to the anarchism that you've been articulating on the show today?
Yeah. So it's actually a good meme that does this, but we can share it and put it in the show notes or something. But, essentially there's two ways to look at this. We can talk about it like historically how they developed, or we can just talk about what their differences are on paper, and we can kind of do both. Like, cause I think classical liberalism is in the umbrella of libertarianism, but it's also at the same time kind of like a proto-libertarianism. It kind of developed out of the Enlightenment, and it definitely started to. It was kind of like, hey, we're pro liberty, we're pro private property and free trade, and the government doesn't have absolute authority. There are some limitations that have to be put on government, but it still draws a lot of exceptions where it's like, okay, but if we need roads, or if we need infrastructure, or even if we need like a minimal security blanket for the people, financially speaking, It's like we want freedom. We're going to try that first, but if it doesn't go the way we want, then we will use the power of the state to initiate force and use that monopoly one size fits all solution to push for something. And then you have what I've described, which is anarchy, and in the middle, as you said, there's this sort of school of libertarianism that is called minarchy, which is like, okay, we see how classical liberalism kind of goes too far. Classical liberalism, although, and I don't want to like throw shade at classical liberals because there's a lot of them that I love, but I also think that it's a legitimate criticism to say that classical liberalism does sort of like it creates the slippery slope that leads to modern day liberalism, which is really just like soft socialism. So there's definitely issues there, but minarchists don't go all the way to anarchy because, well, for different reasons, and we can get into them. And so what they say is what we need is really like this night watchman state. Like we don't want the state to exist to violate property rights. We don't want the state to exist to pick winners and losers. It doesn't need to do roads. It doesn't need to do infrastructure. It literally just needs to do defense and courts. And that's pretty much like minarchists, at least most people who describe themselves as minarchists, say like, we literally just need a government that does the courts and it does like some kind of defense for the people. And that's literally it. So, and then constitutionalists sort of ride the border between minarchism and classical liberalism to some extent. And there is a gray area between minarchy and anarchy. There was a friend of mine, his name was Hody Johns, who used to be a minarchist, and then he did a debate with Larkin Rose on anarchy, and the debate ended with Larkin saying, "Hody, you're just an anarchist who's confused about like your terms," because the type of state that Hody was describing is like, all right, I believe in a state, but it can't institute taxes. Like all of its funding has to be voluntary, and it has to provide courts and defense, but those will be funded, voluntarily. And he was like, the only thing that made him think that it was a state and that he was a minarchist is that like, well, all the people in a particular area could, like in a community, could agree to use like one provider in their area if it's like a small town or something like that, and that people shouldn't be free to commit aggression against one another. He had a slightly misconception about what anarchy was too. But yeah, it's like there's this gray area where it's like, okay, if you have a minarchist state, at what point of how small and local does it get and how voluntarily funded does it get before it basically crosses over into anarcho-capitalism or something like that? And then you also have the flip side where you'll have minarchists critique anarcho-capitalists and say, oh, your little like covenant community is essentially a microstate or something like that. Which is, for those who don't know, covenant community is something by Hans Hermann Hoppe, who basically describes like a bunch of property owners in a small town or community or something could band together and like create essentially kind of like within a anarchist society, like an HOA of sorts, basically, where it's just like, and it's fine. It's all voluntarily formed. So so those are kind of like the three schools of libertarianism. You have classical liberalism, you have anarchy, and then you have minarchy, which, all of this stuff kind of exists on a spectrum, so to speak. So you have, people who are, there's a lot of people I think who are like you, where they're like, they're kind of like in this gray area between minarchy and anarchy. Like they're not like fully committed to anarcho-capitalism, but they're open-minded about it.
Yeah. Yep. And that's exactly where I'm at right now, too. And I think for me, it's more that I just need to do more reading and studying. I think the arguments are out there. I just need to hear them. One of the things that you do on your show, your show is called the Biblical Anarchy podcast. And so you try to draw the connection on your show, obviously, between the Bible and its presentation of government and anarchy. What is the biblical basis for anarchism?
Yeah. So the biblical,
which I know that's a huge question.
Right. Yeah. It's like, all right, so let me do that in 20 minutes. So,
yeah.
So the biblical case for anarchy is, I don't even, it's like, I've used that phrase before, but sometimes I don't even like that phrase. It's like I think where I like to start is just like, what does the Bible say about government and about authority? And then, like, work our way into, and then, what does anarchy say about those things? And and then you kind of end up saying there's a biblical case for anarchy. But, like, the Bible obviously is not anti-government or anti-authority. There are many times in the Bible where it talks about us having a high respect for authority, for legitimate authority, and to submitting to, like, whether it's to our parents or whether it's to like elders or spiritual leaders or authorities in our lives. Wives submit to their husbands, husbands submit to their wives. There's all sorts of examples within the Bible of there being a very high view of authority. And heck, I mean, not to say just not to skip over the authority that God has and having a respect for God's authority, or having a respect for the authority of Scripture. So, and then, on government itself, I mean, the Bible would not be in favor of, like, the caricature of anarchy, which is that, like, there's no rules and anything goes. Like, well, no, like, do not murder, do not steal. I mean, that's kind of like, libertarianism is do not hurt people and do not take their stuff. So, I mean, it's like a retelling of two of the 10 commandments right there. And so, on its face value, people look at the Bible and they go, oh, well, you have authority, you have a need for government, you need a state. But as we just said, okay, well, hold on, we need government. That doesn't necessarily mean the state. Is there anywhere in the Bible that's like, okay, you absolutely need a monopoly of coercion? And not only is really there not, but there's actually, if anything, examples of where there wasn't a monopoly of coercion and things went well enough. I mean, obviously nothing's perfect, and no serious anarchist would ever describe a hypothetical anarchist society as like a utopia where everyone gets along and
Right.
no violence ever
Right.
breaks out. We clearly don't have that I mean, look at all the wars going on right now. It's clear that nation states aren't a great bulwark against war and conflict and criminality. So it's we're always going to have some of those things. But if you look at the book of Judges, there was a long period of time where there was no central ruler in the land of Israel. And, it even says, like, near the end of the book of Judges, it's like everyone, there was no king in the land of Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And yes, there were, like, at times in the book of Judges, especially like at the end, leading up into 1 Samuel, there were some conflicts that happened. There was also, like, decades and really, like, I think, like, I forget the exact math. I think it was like 100 years of just pretty much peace. Like, I'm sure there was, like, conflicts that happened, but 100 years of of no war with, the 12 tribes of Israel amongst each other, and people getting along and freely trading and all that. And I mean, I'm doing a 2-minute summary of an entire book. So, I mean,
Right.
we're trying not to get stuck in the weeds here, but
Yeah.
the book of Judges is important because it's a precursor then to 1 Samuel. And then in 1 Samuel 8, essentially the Israelites go to Samuel and they're like, like you get the sense like they're weary after, like, all this time of essentially being in this anarcho covenant where it's like they God is their ruler and they have to submit to God, submit to, like, the judges in their and that come up and govern themselves according to God's law. And they're like, we're tired of this. We want a king. Like, this is the exact phrasing. We want a king who will fight our own battles and who will solve our problems. And we want to be like everyone else. Everyone else has this. So we want that. And so Samuel goes to God and says, they're asking for a king. And God tells Samuel, like, hey, don't take it personally, because they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king. So right away, God's calling this idolatry, essentially. And then he also tells them, all right, well, let's, tell them that we'll give them a king, but that you will solemnly warn them about the conduct of the king that they will get, which is that he's going to take 10% of everything you have. He's going to take the best of your livestock, the best of your crops. He's going to take your children and make your children fight on the front lines of his wars, like your children and you are going to go before his chariots and before his armies and stuff, and that he ends it with saying, and you will be his slaves, and that you will cry out to me on this day for the king that you have asked for, but I will not answer you. So the introduction of the idea of a king, of a centralized ruler, a monopoly over government, does not come with God going like, and yes, I am establishing the state as what is normative for human government. It's like the exact opposite. It's like, hey, this is idolatrous and it's not going to go well for you. So that's a very important like start to the understanding of what the Bible says about government and authority. And then I'll end it on this, because I could go through the entire Bible like book for book almost and talk about the different things. There, like I said in my opening podcast, I was like, so what does the Bible say about government and human authority? Like more than what can be said in one podcast. Like there's just so much. But I'm just pulling at like the ones that stick out the most to me. And I think that the other thing that really sticks out to me is the passage from Mark. It's Mark chapter 10, verse 42. And, this is essentially, when it's in the vein of like Jesus washing his apostles' feet. And like the apostles were like arguing before this, like they're arguing with one another about who amongst them is going to be the greatest. And Jesus like reprimands them and says like, no, like, hey, don't be like the Gentiles. Like, the Gentiles, they love to, claim their positions of power and authority and lord it over one another and brag about their those things, but it shall not be that way among you. Rather, he says, those among you who want to be the first must become the last, and you must become a servant to all, just as the Son of Man has come to be not a ruler over all, but a servant to all. And so there's obviously implications there about, Jesus and his mission, his ministry to, bring about the salvation of the world. There's also the implication that like, hey, to be, and this was also borne out in just Jesus's life. And I think also most beautifully demonstrated when Jesus washed his apostles' feet, is that to be a leader, like what the Bible says about authority and about being a leader, is that you are to be a servant to the people around you, not a tyrant. You're not to initiate force against people to gain your authority against them. You're to, again, like we talked about in what we do in markets, we exchange value for value. And in a anarcho-capitalist model, and libertarian principles at play, people obtain authority and climb up those hierarchies not through domination and seeking power, but through providing service. And people going, hey, this person is the best person for this job at providing this need that we need. And so they get pushed up that hierarchy and they obtain that position of authority. But then people are voluntarily submitting to it. And so I think those two passages are, you got one Old Testament and one New Testament, are good starting points to summarize what the Bible overall says about human relationships and about government and authority, which is that if we're to have a biblical view of these things and to have a high, and I would agree with the statement that the Bible has a high view of government and authority, but to have the highest view of those things means that they must be done, that authority and government must be acquired, if you're going to do it in a biblical sense, legitimately. And if we're talking about what a legitimate authority is, that is where then we come, what is the biblical case for anarchy? It's like, if you want to have a biblical respect for government and authority, then those things, I think, necessarily then consequentially take on the forms of what anarchist conceptions of those things are.
It's a beautiful answer. How do we go about convincing more Christians that libertarianism and anarchy in particular is the kind of correct political philosophy to have? Right.
So I think there's three parts to it. The first part is just the annoying hurdle that we always have to do. And I'm like, I need to make this a shirt, because like, how there's the libertarian mantra, like about like, but what about my roads? Well, the Christian rebuttal to everything I just said is always, but what about Romans 13? Right? So the first step to convincing more Christians about anarchy is just knowing more about what the Bible says, and then knowing like these. There's a few passages. There's render unto Caesar. There's Romans 13. Those are the two most popular, but there's other things that get brought up. But we have to understand what Christians in good faith are bringing as objections to everything that you and I have been talking about. And I think there are very good answers for that. Again, I can't necessarily give a completely satisfying answer to those in the limited time we have, but like an example, I'll leave Romans 13 aside because like that takes a little bit more time. But like some people look at the render unto Caesar passage, right? And they think, well, Jesus is saying clearly to pay your taxes right there, right? And to give to Caesar what is his. So clearly Jesus is telling us to respect the state and centralized, governments. It's like, well, not really. And so I've done a podcast on this. We can link it in the show notes if you want. And there's also a really good Mises Institute article on this, but we don't even need those. We can just look at what it says in the text of Scripture itself, which it says that the Pharisees sought out to trap Jesus, right? So what's the trap? Well, the trap is, again, we hear in the New Testament all the time, how despised tax collectors are. It's like I think at one point Jesus says, "Let this person be like the tax collector among you." You know what I mean? It's like it's the derogatory term. Well, why is that? Were all these people free market libertarians or anarchists? Like, not really. Really, what their objection was to these tax collectors were that, I mean, for one, they were serving Rome and Caesar, and the Jews viewed that as like the illegitimate government that was ruling over them. And there was also a element to what was going on there that was idolatrous because, again, Caesar kind of claimed to be, partly divine. And so he was claiming he was not only being an illegitimate authority in a political sense, but he was being an idolatrous, illegitimate authority in a spiritual sense. So the Jews viewed those who did business with the Romans and who dealt with like the Roman coin and then especially those who would collect the taxes for the Romans as like especially like an anathema to them, like someone engaged in very grave sin and something they found to be distasteful. And so the trap here is that the Pharisees are going, okay, we hope that Jesus says the obvious answer, which is no, don't pay your taxes to Caesar because it's illegitimate, because they want to get Jesus in trouble with the Romans and go, look, he's saying don't pay your taxes, arrest him. Or he'll say, pay your taxes, and then he'll lose credibility among his followers. So that's what the trap is. But then Jesus disarms the trap. And how does he say it? He says, first of all, says, show me the coin in question, which outs the Pharisees, they were in the class of Herod, and they were dealing with the Romans. So it's kind of like, first of all, Jesus is exposing their hypocrisy because he's like, well, you're doing it. So let's get that out of the way. And then he's like, all right, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's. Okay, well then, though that statement necessarily begs the question, what is Caesar's and what is God's? Well, everything is God's, right? And what are especially God's, what belongs to God the most that we have? Our worship, our allegiance, right? And so you can't, what does Jesus say? You can't serve two masters. You're either a citizen of God, of the kingdom of God and of heaven, or you can be a citizen of the kingdoms of this world. But you can't do both. So if you're going to really render unto God what is God's, there's nothing left to render unto Caesar. Not only that, but we could ask just in an economic sense, well, what is Caesar owed? Like, and then what is anyone owed? Well, does the Bible define property rights by people are owed what they claim they are owed at the point of a gun? Like, do you owe the mugger the money in your wallet? No, of course not. That's theft. And so it's also equally illegitimate when a state comes in and at the point of a gun says, give me 50% of your income. So that's one example of how these common misconceptions have to be dealt with and dispelled. And then the other two things are that once you break through that barrier, I think we can convince more Christians of the, I don't even want to say the truth of libertarianism. It's more like to show Christians that that the truths of what the Bible teaches about, again, government and economics and all that lines up exactly with what libertarians have discovered is true just in like the natural world and in natural law and all that. It's like, of course, libertarians discovered that the natural law and order is, it just happens to coincide with what the Bible teaches. You know what I mean? Like that, or it doesn't just happen to. There's a reason for that. So,
Yes.
So we have to, after we get through those initial objections, we have to then point to, okay, what does the Bible teach about all these things? And we have to, teach them, a little bit of libertarian literature in terms of just economics and having a sound understanding of the various ways in which the state distorts the economy and distorts authority and distorts the natural order of God's creation around us. And then the third thing is, I kind of already said this, but again, a necessary component of our faith in Jesus Christ means having where our allegiance lies. And, are we going to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven or citizens of the kingdom of this world? And yes, we're called to be in this world, but not of it. And so that's a careful distinction. We are ambassadors here, and this is not our home. And so, there's, I forget, like several dozen times over in the Old and New Testament where the kingdoms of this world are referred to as basically not only the kingdoms of man, but the kingdoms of Satan. That essentially Satan is the ruler of this world. That's said a lot, especially in the New Testament. Jesus says this. I think Paul says this, and James says this as well. John says it in the book of Revelation. There's so many times where, and it's anytime it says the ruler of this world, it's a reference to Satan. And so there's reasons for that, right? So there's the objections, there's the understanding libertarian theory, and then there's the understanding the aspect of our faith and our religion that necessarily calls us to live with that kingdom mentality. I think those are the three things that we have to kind of like this. It's a three-pronged approach that I think we have to do to reform Christianity and the church to be in line with what I think the Bible clearly teaches.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. Well, you're very much involved in the Libertarian Party, so maybe you could talk about your role there a little bit. And obviously, like the Libertarian Party is comprised, and libertarianism as a movement in the United States is comprised of minarchists and classical liberals and anarchists. But I think the thing that we all have in common is that we're all individualists, and so trying to organize a large group of individualists is always going to be very difficult. So just talk a little bit about maybe like kind of like the state of the party, and then where do you see libertarianism at in 2023? In the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's kind of like herding libertarians is like herding cats with that are all holding AR-15s.
Right.
It's just a funny thing to think about. But so there's a few different things there. So my role in the Libertarian Party is several. I'm the chair of my local county affiliate here in York County, Pennsylvania. And I'm also the chair of the social media subcommittee within the Libertarian Party of Pennsylvania. So I run the social media pages for both the York County and for the Pennsylvania Libertarian Party. And I'm also a state organizer for the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus here in my state of Pennsylvania. So I wear a lot of different hats. I'm also getting I guess I could talk a little bit about it. I'm also a co-founder of the brand new Libertarian Party Christian Caucus. So if you haven't checked that yet out, you can find us on Twitter. I'm excited about that. So those are my different roles, and they involve different things. But like I think generally what I do is I try to preach the message of libertarianism out there in the various outlets that I do. And then on the local level, I try to engage in my community, try to run people for office at local levels, to try to, enact local change primarily. A lot of it comes from like I keep on shouting out different members of our team. A lot of it comes from like the 10th Amendment Center, from like Michael Bolden and Mike Meharry, and nullification legislation is kind of like one of the things that I think are the most important and useful tools at our disposal for kind of pushing back against the state and kind of clawing back some of our liberties and rights. Because you can do things at the local level that don't really pass laws that like increase the state. But what they do is increase your local government's sovereignty, and they uh, push back against the feds in that way. You can do this through like Second Amendment sanctuaries. You can do drug decriminalization at your local level. I know Christians probably don't care about that so much, but it is somewhat important. I mean, I think, I know people in my church who use medical marijuana. Like it's, I think it's a legitimate thing that can be used to the benefit of someone for their health and whatnot. At the very least, those things should be, I think, more decided at the local level and not at the federal level. But you can do Second Amendment sanctuaries. You can do criminal justice reform. Defend the Guard is another cool one that's actually picking up some traction. I know, I think Arizona just made major headway on Defend the Guard legislation. I think it passed in the Senate. So that's all stuff that, like, you can check out the 10th Amendment Center. You can check out the Mises Caucus. They both kind of focus on those things. And I'm a big believer in those. I think they're good strategies to implement. And where it pertains to kind of like, the status of the party and the movement, and it also kind of pertains to the things we were talking about to kind of tie things in a nice bow, is that, yes, I'm an anarchist. I'm also a political realist. Like, we're obviously, I could go on, like, I could do 3 to 4 hours on how anarchism would solve or work in different areas, but we're obviously so far away from that right now. And that's probably the biggest objection to anarchism, that like the most effective one is like, how do you get from where we're at now to that kind of society? And, listen, I'm not an all or nothing, anarchist. It's like, if we can take incremental steps towards increasing freedom, increasing decentralization, I'm all for that. Heck, even if the best we can achieve here on this fallen world is a classical liberal society, oh my gosh, that's so much better than what we have now. A minarchist society, even better if we could do that. Yeah. Maybe we can't have anarchism around the world, and maybe certain local areas could experiment or make headway there. The liberty movement, I mean, there's a lot of good things and a lot of troubling things going on in the movement and the party, because there's just a lot of moving parts, and there's people with different priorities, people with different visions, people with different tactics. And there's two things, I guess, that come to mind when I want to talk about this. One, which is that amidst all the different moving parts, I think that there is solid progress to celebrate and to call attention to. Like the Libertarian Party, recently, after it was taken over by the Mises Caucus, as engaged in more anti-war activism, which I'm, one of the things I talk about a lot on my podcast, Beyond Anarchy and the Biblical Case for Anarchy. But I also talk about the biblical case for being anti-war, which is a whole other topic that maybe I'll have to come back on the show sometime to talk about. But, so the Libertarian Party did this huge anti-war rally back in February that was a huge success. It was an issue-based coalition rally. So it had more than just libertarians. It had people from the right, people from the far left, people from the center. This rally had people like Ron Paul and Tulsi Gabbard and Jill Stein from the Green Party, and Scott Horton gave a speech there. Just like, you saw all these different people coming together to say, like, we oppose the U.S. involvement in the Ukraine-Russian war, and we call for everyone to lay down their arms and to work towards negotiating a peace and to stop killing, hundreds of thousands or potentially millions of innocent people. That's a huge thing. The Libertarian Party has not always been good at taking large stands against things like this. They were largely silent during the COVID-19 lockdowns. They were largely silent about things like the genocide in Yemen and other things going on. But solid progress has been made there. They're reaching out, doing more projects like that. The finances look bad, but I think that has a lot more to do with the economy right now. Everyone's just strapped tight, and we're going to be in a buckling up period. Everyone's going to be in a buckling up period and kind of just having to run things on a tighter budget and tighter ship. And I think another things that happened over the last year. The Libertarian Party got rid of its pro-abortion plank, which was a huge step in the right direction for the Libertarian Party, because before it had a plank that essentially said that although there's good faith arguments on both sides, we think that essentially like that the government shouldn't be involved in abortion at all. And again, that's a touchy subject. It's like, as an anarchist, should the state be involved in abortion? It's like, well, I don't believe in a state, but I also don't believe in a lawless society. So, insofar as the state exists now, should it do something about abortion? I largely land on the side of, at the federal level, no, but at the state and local level, yes, but it needs to be done in particular ways. There's good and bad ways to write or enforce any law. But the point is, like, the Libertarian Party before was, explicitly pro-choice, and now it isn't. Now it allows people who are pro-life a seat at the table. And so I think that's an important development. And at the same time, it's not wise to put your faith in a political entity. So I think the Libertarian Party can be a good tool for freedom and for advancing different things that I'm interested in advancing. But it's always important to ultimately put our faith in Jesus Christ and put our faith in, store our treasures up in heaven, right? So I think that the Libertarian Party is, it's a bit of a microcosm of just like life in general, right? It's like we engage in the world, right? And we should try to push to make the world a better place. But we also have to understand that, like, we can't centrally plan everything around us to work out the way we want it to be. And that's kind of the ironic thing about libertarians, is that sometimes we reject central planning in theory, but then we get upset when we can't centrally plan things around us to happen in the way we want them to happen. It's like life just doesn't work that way. Instead, we have to trust in God and His sovereignty, and that He's orchestrating things behind the scenes, and that our goals should always be, I think, locally focused, which the Libertarian Party, again, that has been promoting more of, and that's all good. But ultimately, if I could choose between making like 100,000 more libertarians or bringing 100 more people to embrace the gospel and Jesus as their savior, I take the latter. I take the second one, like all day, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You know what I mean? But my involvement in the Libertarian Party gives me the ability to talk to so many people who are not Christians, and to, be able to preach the gospel into their lives, or to be a witness of the gospel in my own life, and how I conduct myself and how I treat people around me, how I treat my family, the things I prioritize, and things like that. And so that can't be understated either. So I think that, Libertarian Party, like anything that's involved in politics, is, this giant mess, and some of it's, I think, beautiful and amazing, and some of it is, it's people, and so it's necessarily ugly and messy and complicated. But there's been a lot of change in the Libertarian Party over the past year, and although change can often, be uncomfortable and hard, and so there have been struggles as the Libertarian Party has gone through this reorganization, I think that it's primed, or poised rather, to continue to expand on the good things that it's been doing. And I think, Christians who are libertarians or liberty minded, shouldn't be afraid to check out the Libertarian Party, and for two reasons. One, it gives you a vehicle to engage your local community and to try to, make things better for your family and your church and your neighbors and stuff, to live, to be more free to serve God and not be controlled or dictated to by the state. And then also, it's just another opportunity for us to go out there and be fishers of men, like we're called to be, and to be salt and light. And ultimately, at the foundation, at the base level of libertarianism and anarchism, and what the Libertarian Party stands for, is peace. And that's something, as Christians, we're called to be peacemakers. Jesus was called the Prince of Peace, Emmanuel. And that's part of that. The the role of Jesus as Messiah, although he hasn't fulfilled it yet because he came first to fulfill his priestly duties, but ultimately the Messiah, when Jesus comes back and completes all of those prophecies, it talks about, like in different passages in Isaiah, that all the conflicts between the nations and all the wars, that they will come to an end, and that the imagery used that the lion will lay down with the lamb, and that a small child will lead them, and that there will be no violence upon his holy mountain. And so, as Christians, we're called to be peacemakers. We're called to live at peace with all as far as it depends upon us. If you love your neighbor, you don't want to see them blown to bits. You don't want to see them have their rights violated. You don't want to see them locked up in cages. You don't want to see violence done upon them. And so if we want to live that call out, we have two calls, right? Love God with all our soul, heart, and strength, and love our neighbor as ourselves, and also to love our enemies. The first part, we do that by going to church, by being good fathers, by being good husbands, or more mothers or wives, to female
for the four women that listen to this show,
right? We do that by going to church. We do that by spreading the gospel and by living that kingdom mentality. But then, there's many different ways to love our neighbor. But I think, being part of the liberty movement or being part of the Libertarian Party are both ways that Christians can do both things. They can love God and love their neighbor by spreading the gospel and by working with people who are like-minded to push back against those who wish to spread violence and war and tyranny and oppression, and to instead push, Christian values that exist within libertarianism of peace, of cooperation, and goodwill.
Well, Jacob Winograd, this has been a great show. Before I let you go, just tell people where they can find your work.
Yeah, of course. Well, first, thanks so much for having me on. This was a blast, and I'd love to do it again sometime.
Yeah,
and I'm also just so happy that you're part of the Christians for Liberty network now, and that
thanks.
That the LCI team is growing. I think you're a great addition. And so, where people can find me, easiest ways, you can find me on Twitter at Biblical Anarchy if you want to follow what I do there. As far as the podcast, it's everywhere. It's on YouTube, it's on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, things like that. Or you can go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and keep up with what I'm doing there.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to put links to all that in the show notes. Jacob, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks again, man.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.